Welcome to this Architecture Today webinar with programme partners Schu, the Green Premium, calculating the value of net zero buildings. In a moment, your chair, Ruth Slavid, but first, let's get started with Schu UK's Commercial Director, Sean Butler.
Welcome to the first of our series of 80 Schu webinars in 2022. Last year, Bill Gates published his Green Manifesto, in which he developed the concept of the Green Premium, exploring the additional costs of choosing a clean technology over one that emits a greater amount of greenhouse gases. It highlights the areas where we can invest immediately to make a difference, and those areas where we urgently need research and development to help make clean options more affordable as quickly as possible. At Schu, we have adopted a 360-degree sustainability approach, covering the entire life cycle of a product from the production and usage phase through to recycling. We will continue to invest in window and facade technology that conserve resources and meet the demands for working and living spaces that promote health while minimizing the consumption of energy and preserve resources. Today's webinar is not just about scrutinizing the relative cost premium of net zero options. We will also consider how sustainable offices and regeneration schemes can attract higher rents and increase the long-term value of the building. And what are the ways we can measure that and communicate it effectively to clients and investors. We're very lucky to have three expert speakers to take us through the work they have each undertaken in this area, update us on the definitions and drivers for net zero carbon, explore the increasing role for green finance, and explain the lessons they learned building the business case underpinning the transition to net zero. Thanks once again for joining us. I'll now pass you to Ruth, who's chairing today's event.
Thank you, Sean. I think this is going to be a really interesting and valuable session. It's a truism that good buildings need good clients. And in the same way, I think green buildings need green clients. So today's webinar, which is going to look both at what clients are thinking and at the arguments for moving towards net zero carbon, those arguments can be made to clients, is going to have a terrific impact. Things seem to be moving finally very fast. Architects have been talking about greener buildings for so long and struggling, except in a few special cases, to get them built. Now things are really on the move. I'm sure that this is going to stimulate a lot of thought amongst all of you. And I would ask you, as questions occur to you, please do hit the question button and send them in, because we will have the opportunity both to put a couple of questions to each speaker after their presentation, and then there will be a general discussion at the end, and your questions will make that much richer. So as Sean said, we do have a really good lineup of speakers. We are going to be hearing from Simon Wyatt from Cundall and also from Gary Clarke from HOK. But first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Elaine Rossall, who is Head of UK Office Research at JLL. Elaine.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about sustainability. As you know, sustainability is becoming a mainstream issue within the real estate sector. I think it's going to become ever more fundamental in the process of delivering office space as it moves up the occupier agenda. My presentation today is based on research we undertook during the last 18 to 24 months to determine the business case for sustainable offices in the central London and the big six regional office markets. For those that don't know, the big six markets are Birmingham, Bristol, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leeds and Manchester. We set out to examine the trends in the performance of sustainable office buildings in terms of both rental value and leasing velocity. And we've focused our analysis on space that had a BREEAM rating or an EPC certificate, both of course, which are both widely available environmental rating systems. For the purpose of the presentation today, I'm just going to really focus on that BREEAM analysis. We also tried to quantify to what extent the demand for sustainable buildings is increasing and how occupiers are approaching the issue more generally. And finally, we wanted to look to the future and explore how developers and landlords really need to focus their portfolio in a world that will increasingly revolve around stricter energy performance targets, the rise of net zero carbon and the circular economy. First of all, I think it's really important to set the scene. Why is it really important for the corporate real estate sector to consider a more sustainable world? Well, a figure that is widely bandied around is that real estate and infrastructure is responsible for 40% of global carbon emissions. But it's actually much higher than that in urban areas, being actually closer to 2/3. So whether we own, occupy, develop or invest in buildings, we are responsible for preventing runaway climate change. We know that workers value sustainability, and it's a cause of particular interest to younger people. A survey of US corporate employees found that 40% of young people will choose a job because of a company's environmental policy and will be willing to take a pay cut to facilitate that. So for many companies now, it's more about what the next generation of workers wants and how they support those ambitions. And JLR's own Emerging Talent Survey highlighted that over 60% of our applicants rate sustainability as one of the top 3 criteria when choosing where to apply. So we recognise that our own sustainability programme and net zero carbon ambitions are crucial for attracting the next generation of workforce. And we're not alone. For the research, we undertook a number of interviews with corporates, and talent came up time and time again as one of the 3 main drivers for adopting more sustainable behaviour. And we're starting to see an important step change in workers' attitudes. Individuals are starting to make decisions about their own personal association with more sustainable products, and of which the company they work for is one, and by extension, so is the space in which they work. But one of the other factors that occupiers also mentioned is that they're also facing growing pressures from their investors to embed sustainability at the core of their business strategies. We're seeing a large number of investment groups publicly pivoting towards sustainability. So corporates are coming under intense pressure from their investors to demonstrate the positive environmental impact they make in the communities in which they operate. So what this really means is that companies have the opportunity to showcase a clear commitment to going net zero carbon or going more sustainable via their real estate. And we're seeing this come through in the number of companies who are declaring a climate emergency and who are publishing their ambitions to be net zero carbon. The number of companies publicly signing up to sustainability targets, whether that's net zero carbon, science-based targets, renewable energy 100, for example, the number is actually growing exponentially. And we can see that from the graph on screen. Most companies are signing up to science-based targets, and there are actually over 2,300 companies around the globe who have committed to or are in the process of setting targets to reduce their climate emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And we've used that as a data set as a proxy for assessing demand. We estimate that just under half of those companies have a presence in the UK. And while the majority have an office in central London, there are an increasing number of firms with an office in the regional cities. And what we've tried to do on the graph is show the footprint of those companies and how it has changed over time as more and more firms have signed up to those targets. We estimate that there's an equivalent of over 33 million square feet of companies' commitments in terms of floor space. And you can see that that demand has tripled in the last 3 years. That's a phenomenal increase in potential demand, and one that we expect to continue to increase as the number of companies signing up expands. And each of those companies obviously has a different time frame, but a lot of those companies have a 2030 ambition. So what that means is that those companies actually have to take action now. And when we look at the footprint of those companies, most of those companies have a lease expiry between now and 2030. What this means in real terms is that property teams in those companies will be thinking about the implications of their sustainability ambitions that need to be taken over the next few years. And when we looked at those companies who'd already signed up to science-based targets, over half have also declared ambitions for their business to be net zero carbon, for example. So this places more pressure on the real estate team to help deliver those ambitions. So the real estate teams, what they'll be doing, they'll be putting together a plan for their estates and looking at the additional investment needed to deliver on this. And again, we've done some analysis on their footprint, and you can see from the graph on the right-hand side of the screen that the current buildings that those companies occupy, that only 43% of space is currently in assets rated BREEAM outstanding or excellent. So anything below that is unlikely to meet the wider corporate needs. This suggests that leasing a more sustainable or higher rated BREEAM building, or indeed a net zero carbon office, will be one way for the real estate teams to help their companies achieve those ambitious sustainability targets. So let's move on and consider the actual supply of sustainable office buildings. We, of course, are aware that there's a plethora of sustainability rating systems in operation. But for the purposes of this analysis, we're just looking at the BREEAM rated buildings. We've used data from the BRE, that's the Building Research Establishment, and looked at their database. And we estimate that just over 10% of the built office stock in the Big Six and Central London actually has a good to outstanding BREEAM rating. Few buildings are now completed without a BREEAM rating, but to date, few landlords have actually pushed on to achieve that top rating, with only a handful of outstanding assets available in these cities. And these are illustrated on the right-hand side of the screen. As you can see from the graph on the left-hand side, most schemes have actually gained excellent classifications. And that's been pushed now through local planning guidelines, which obviously set minimum BREEAM ratings for new developments in their markets. So you can see that about half of buildings in Central London, the Big Six, have achieved an excellent rating. Although I think it's really important to note that actually half are actually assessed under the 2008 rating system. So they're not directly comparable to those buildings that have been assessed much later. And I think that's a really important point to bear in mind. But of course, the next wave of sustainable buildings is going to go beyond BREEAM and will be targeting net zero carbon. Net zero carbon is an umbrella term often used in relation to the built environment, and it's essentially a framework to achieve that ambition. Momentum is building to reduce carbon within the built environment, but we've seen several assets staking a claim to be net zero carbon in operation. But the challenge to reduce embodied carbon to zero is much, much more difficult. However, it's a challenge that must be met, given that it's estimated that in a typical new office building, the structure can represent over 50% of the initial embodied carbon, according to the UK Green Building Council. There are only a handful of net zero carbon buildings currently built, including 100 Liverpool Street and 80 Charlotte Street in London. And there are currently no net zero carbon buildings fully available which meet the UK Green Buildings Council's framework for both embodied and operational carbon. There are several net zero carbon buildings currently underway, such as EQ in Bristol, Wellington Place in Leeds, and the Forge in central London. And what we're seeing is that developers are now starting to wake up to this opportunity. They're starting to take their commitments to a more sustainable real estate much more seriously. But these buildings are obviously going to take some time to come to market. However, with that momentum building around the demand for net zero carbon, there is a real clear gap between the demand and the supply. But how do sustainable buildings perform? We know from talking to developers and investors that sometimes increased upfront costs can often act as a barrier to the delivery of sustainable office buildings. But when we look at global studies, they tend to show that sustainable buildings have higher rents, quicker leasing, and better longer-term performance than less sustainable buildings. So we set out to consider whether that trend was evident across the UK. We've analysed leasing transactions over the last 10 years in both Central London and the Big Six to start to understand building performance of space with that BREEAM rating. Due to the sample size and data availability, we've adopted a slightly different methodology, which I won't go into in great detail now, but essentially the conclusions were similar. We obviously isolated factors such as pre-lets, tower floors, location, timing, etc., so they didn't skew the results and didn't influence the rents. And that was really to allow as close as a like-for-like comparison as was possible. The results of our analysis showed that in Central London, offices rated outstanding and excellent typically achieved a rent 10% higher than the average achieved Grade A rent. Now, that had been fairly consistent over the last 10 years, but I think what was really noticeable is that that gap has been widening between the rents achieved on outstanding and excellent buildings and those with very good ratings. In the regional markets, there also appeared to be a relationship between achieved rents and lower BREEAM ratings, and that was evident across all the markets analysed. Although the problem is that in most of those markets, the sample sizes are just too small to be statistically significant. So what we did in the regional markets, we compared the achieved rents to prime rents, which showed that office rated as BREEAM outstanding typically set the prime rent in those markets, while those that had an excellent rating typically achieved 5% below the prime rent and very good 10% below. So similar trend to what we saw in Central London. But performance is also about reducing void periods on initial letting. And that was something recognised by a number of developers that we also interviewed for the research, especially in the regional office markets. It was really felt that there was a greater degree of sensitivity to rents in the regions than perhaps seen in Central London. And that's represented by the quote on screen. And most regional developers that we interviewed believed that the performance benefit from sustainable offices had come through improved leasing velocity rather than through a major uplift in rental values. Although it was interesting to note that they were much more optimistic they would see a wide differential in rents through delivery of net zero carbon spaces than perhaps through just BREEAM rated offices. So to understand leasing velocity, we focused analysis on all new developments completed between 2013 and 2018. It covered around 250 buildings in total. And the reason we stopped at 2018 was to allow us that 2-year post-completion horizon. It also fortuitously helped us miss out on the lockdown COVID period. So our analysis suggests that there was a distinct correlation between BREEAM ratings and velocity. And it supported the hypothesis that there is payback for investors who target higher ratings through shorter void periods throughout the cycle. The analysis showed that schemes that have a higher BREEAM rating tend to see a higher pace of leasing and have that lower void rate at both 12 months and 24 months after completion. The outstanding and excellent schemes are more likely to be pre-let than very good schemes, and so at 2 years post-completion, outstanding and excellent schemes have a void rate of only 9% compared to 16% for very good in the Big Six markets and 7% versus 17% in central London. I think it's probably worth noting that the BREEAM rating is not the sole factor for low vacancy, more so a contributing factor amongst many other market fundamentals, and it's much more difficult to isolate the environmental rating for this type of analysis. But what we're seeing is that occupiers are increasingly considering that wider ESG principles of location and asset now, and there is an evidence that this is becoming much more magnified during the pandemic. As we enter the recovery phase, I think it's become increasingly evident that companies are no longer prepared to consider occupying environmentally damaging buildings. So proximity to green space, accessibility by bike or public transport, and an amenity offer that has remained vibrant despite the pandemic is also going to be vital. I think it's also worth noting that many of these factors are already taken into account in sustainability ratings. And we fully expect that there will be an increasing prevalence of corporate mandates towards sustainability, and BREEAM is going to become a much more prominent deciding factor over the next few years. But we're also going to see other accreditations rise up the corporate agenda, and we'll see more and more developments targeting schemes such as Neighbours, Well, as well as obviously striving to be net zero carbon. This focus on BREEAM ratings is borne out by another survey that we did. It's called our Responsible Enterprise Survey. And that showed that of the occupiers that we interviewed, 45% already prioritised building credential certifications. And another 40% expect to implement this by 2025. The slide also shows the investor focus on sustainability certification. And again, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, 48% of investors that we interviewed said that they already seek LEED or BREEAM certification when they're looking at building or buying a new office development. And again, you can see that the pace of change is expected to increase significantly by 2025. The increasing focus for investors is really being borne out from a practical level. And we've also seen that through a number of the other surveys that we've conducted. We do an annual investor survey, and 2 years ago, we asked the question, what are the long-term trends that will have the greatest impact on the UK real estate? In 2009, it was really interesting that sustainability was actually at the bottom of the list, and only 7% of respondents included it. Fast forward to just 12 months, and in 2020, sustainability had moved to the top of the list, with 70% of respondents including it. That's a dramatic increase in just 1 year. So what we're seeing is that investors are clearly starting to recognise the potential impact on their portfolios that from sustainability. And this is also clearly illustrated by the latest survey that we did, which is shown on screen. More than 2/3 who responded said that they will give sustainability a higher priority than they had over the last 12 months. And those institutions, I've said, are focusing on 2030, not 2050, which is effectively just one property cycle away. And actually what that could mean is that we could see many stranded assets within the next 10 years if they don't meet those sustainability criteria. And investors are also making commitments. What we're showing on screen is that the number of investors that have made net zero carbon commitments, science-based targets, or any other Paris-aligned commitments. And again, we can see that at the moment, about just under half, 43% of investors have made that commitment to net zero carbon so far. And it's again anticipated to reach over 70% in just 12 months. This shows the tremendous focus and momentum that we're seeing in the marketplace. Although we do know that obviously commitments are the easiest part and following up is much more difficult to action. So just to kind of conclude and to summarise, what I'd really like you to take away from the presentation today is Number one, let's be very crystal clear that there is a real value differential in delivering sustainable office buildings. Number two, there really is a wave of occupiers ready and waiting for net zero carbon and more sustainable offices. A wave of occupiers who have big targets to meet and who are only going to get ever more demanding. And finally, we think there is a real premium opportunity for net zero carbon buildings if you move fast. But the conversation will increasingly move towards brown discount as low performing buildings are increasingly rejected. I hope you found the presentation interesting, and thank you very much.
That was really interesting. We've had some questions coming in. One of them is says, many office buildings achieve the BREEAM Excellent rating. Is that score sufficient to hit the UK net zero strategy targets?
The issue that we have at the moment is that BREEAM is the only rating that we do have. I think it goes a long way to kind of focusing the industry's attention on those sustainability targets, and it's something that people do understand. I think the problem with the BREEAM ratings is obviously that's just how buildings are designed. It doesn't necessarily translate into actually how buildings are occupied, and I think that's going to be one of the critical points moving forward for us to reach our net zero carbons, actually how we use our buildings moving forward, which is why those new ratings such as neighbours, I think will be more relevant to the industry as we move forward.
We had a question asking about what void rates are and what is rent letting velocity. I mean, my understanding is a void rate is how many buildings are empty, and the letting velocity is how quickly you let them. So the two are related to each other.
Yes, apologies if I made an assumption that everybody understood that. So basically the void rate is, yes, as you say, is how much vacant space there is in a building over time, and velocity is how quickly that building lets up. So basically the research is showing that a more sustainable building has a lower vacancy rate and lets up much more quickly than a non-sustainable building.
Also, I mean, you showed a chart near the end where you were showing, percentage of companies that are making commitments, and it's really encouraging to see how quickly that's changing. Somebody actually asked if there is a list of companies that shows who is committed to these targets.
Yeah, so as I said, there are, companies are declaring that their net zero carbon emissions almost on a daily basis.
Yes.
We've used those signing up to science-based targets because it is a more rigorous system and is a measured way so it's a measured rating system. On the science-based target website, you can download the list of companies, and on that website, on the list, it tells you whether the company's committed or whether it's already set its targets, and whether those targets are short-term targets or long-term targets.
You mentioned the fact that how much employees and future employees are really concerned about the sustainability credentials of the places they work in. I mean, how sophisticated do you think their understanding is, or how easy is it for an employer to greenwash to them?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think one of the problems we have as the real estate industry more generally is understanding our carbon emissions, and obviously the move to the more sustainable world has accelerated dramatically over the last few years. So I think the industry itself is still coming to terms with grappling what kind of data we need and how to demonstrate the sustainability of our own individual buildings. So I think it's probably at the moment it's quite difficult for employees to really understand the extent that our buildings contribute to the carbon emissions of an individual company. I think it's important for companies themselves to start to educate, and I think there's particularly enlightened companies. I mean, JLR, for example, we're educating our employees as to what our own carbon emissions mean, where our existing portfolios do and don't meet our carbon targets, and what our strategy is to meet those targets over time. So I think companies are going to come under greater scrutiny as to how they live up to their ideals. But I think as sustainability becomes more prevalent in the real estate industry, we're going to start to see much more robust data to support those kind of carbon and energy targets, which will make it a much easier comprehension for those employees in those individual companies.
We will come back to you when we come back to our discussion at the end. And before I introduce the next speaker, I would just say, we've really valued the questions that were sent in If you have more questions for Elaine, do send them. And also, if you have questions, obviously, for our next speaker and the one after, send those as well, because it really does make this a richer experience. Now, I am delighted to introduce our second speaker, who is Simon Wyatt, who is a partner at Cundall. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Ruth. As you said, my name's Simon Wyatt. I'm a partner at Cundall. I lead our net zero carbon and ESG programs. And today I'm going to be sharing some case studies and some findings that we've seen over the last couple of years in terms of the value of net zero carbon. I'm not going to go through the background and definitions in a lot of detail because that's kind of been covered elsewhere. And I just want to really jump into some of the key details. Over the last couple of years, we've really seen a number of drivers for net zero carbon from central governments around the world, especially the UK, declaring a climate emergency back in 2019, followed by pretty much all local authorities declaring their own emergency and setting even more ambitious targets than the central government. And then there's been a significant groundswell of public action and in the media around net zero carbon, which was intensifying before COVID. We expected COVID to have a bit of an impact, but to be honest, the public response to the climate emergency has kept to a pace and has really been pushing central governments and organisations. So we're seeing huge drivers across different sectors and different areas for decarbonisation. In terms of the built environment, we're seeing similar drivers for change from investors, developers and occupiers, working with a number of institutional landlords where occupiers are setting their own science-based targets and net zero carbon strategies and saying that if the buildings do not meet their requirements and help them hit their targets, they will be moving. So there's huge pressure on landlords to decarbonise their assets or risk voids or reductions in rents. Similarly, we've seen a huge movement with developers. Most developers have now committed to net zero carbon commitments via the World Green Building Council or Better Building Partnership. This requires them to achieve their net zero carbon standards in a certain period, produce roadmaps. The main reason they're doing this is partly because they want to and they have their green aspirations, but similarly funding is being heavily linked to ESG requirements and net zero carbon. And that's where the investors really come in and where we've seen probably the most movement in the last 2 years. So most investment hedge funds, banks, pension funds are now setting very stringent ESG requirements and are reporting into things like GRESB and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is requiring them to have clear roadmaps and definitions for achieving net zero carbon and how they do their green funding. And what we've seen over the last 2 years is demand for green investment and green bonds has outstripped supply almost 4 to 1. So there's definitely a market for green investment. And in order to do that, they need standards to get there. As I said, one of the biggest drivers is obviously coming from TCFD, which requires organisations to report their climate risk, but also their mitigation strategies. And in terms of their mitigation strategies, one of the main ways that people are doing that is via the CREM tool, which is basically looking at current performance of building stock and then setting a trajectory to a 1.5 degree alignment by 2050. So you can go onto the CREM tool, choose any type of building in any location. It will give you the kind of current performance and requirements and then a steady trajectory downwards. And what a lot of investment organizations are doing is mapping their assets against this CREM trajectory. So they're basically going through their entire portfolio to understand where their current performance is, which is generally for most newer buildings below that green line, the trajectory. But if they do nothing to it, to that asset, it will eventually get to a point where it crosses the green line, which is known as a stranding event. This doesn't have any physical impact on the building, but what this is starting to do is put the asset at risk of devaluation. And what large institutional investors are starting to do is look through that to see what retrofit and action is needed to take to assets and portfolios to reduce that stranding risk or move that stranding risk out further, with the aim of ultimately aligning to a 1.5 degree trajectory. They're doing this to future-proof themselves against potential carbon tax and levies, and also to meet their ESG requirements. So as I said, there's no requirement to do it now, but a lot of organizations are doing it as part of their ESG, but also the main reason is to de-risk the financial implications that are likely to come from central governments, the European Union, and carbon taxes as they start to be introduced over the next few years. So what does this mean for buildings? Well, buildings, the first thing we have to do is look at definitions, and net zero carbon buildings has really been accelerating in understanding and implementation over the last 2 years, and we've really started to see the industry come together and define what we mean by net zero carbon buildings. One of the key differentiators from carbon neutral, which I think is pretty much standard now, is that there's a clear understanding that carbon neutral just means that you work out your carbon emissions and offset down to zero with removals. There's no requirement to achieve any standard before you do those offsets. You can offset as much as you like, whereas net zero carbon requires you to align your emissions to a 1.5 degree scenario before you remove. So you need to hit stringent targets around operational energy, embodied carbon, before you go to those removals. Most developers and most of the industry are setting their targets and aspirations around net zero carbon. There are a few developers that have actually gone a step further and are looking at absolute zero, which means that they're looking to get down to zero without removals, which is possible with things like operational energy at the moment with renewables, but for embodied carbon, it means a complete shift in the supply chain and working with your supply chains, and it's going to be extremely challenging, but extremely interesting how those developers get on with those targets they're looking at. So as I said, there's two key requirements when we're talking about the built environment. We have net zero carbon in operation, which is a significant proportion of the UK's emissions. And then we also have net zero carbon on construction, which is raising in importance with the precedents and trying to get regulation on embodied carbon. Both of these over the last couple of years have had their definitions refined, and we now have clear definitions from the Whole Life Carbon Network, LETI, and the RIBA for both the operational energy and embodied carbon. So operational energy, there's kind of four main requirements. One is that no fossil fuels are used on site. Energy use is minimalized in line with those Paris proof targets. That meets local energy targets, which in the UK is generally UK GBC and LETI targets. And then all energy is generated from renewables, either on-site or off-site, using power purchase agreements and green tariffs, which again can be problematic. In terms of net zero carbon on construction, the focus is on upfront embodied carbon. So it's about reducing the upfront embodied carbon associated with the construction. And then offsetting down to zero, but only once you've met the targets. So what we've seen a lot of schemes do is offset their carbon footprint of the upfront embodied carbon, but if they don't meet the intensity target, then they can't claim to be net zero carbon. They can only claim to be carbon neutral. This has to be considered in conjunction with whole life carbon because we don't want to be making decisions which might be low embodied carbon on day one, but have huge carbon implications later. So really trying to define the difference between upfront embodied carbon, which can be reported fairly accurately now on practical completion and is the focus of where we want to be going. But being mindful of whole life carbon and looking at calculations to achieve those kind of standards. What's recently been published and we've been involved in is a consistency project. So obviously over the last few years, we've seen LETI, the RIBA and a few others come out with carbon targets. They cover slightly different things, with LETI focusing on upfront embodied carbon and RIBA looking at whole life carbon. They've now been aligned and starting to put together sliding scales like EPCs of what is good and best practice, and a number of schemes are starting to report their carbon emissions against these, with the best kind of new build schemes generally achieving upfront embodied carbons around the CB band, which is extremely challenging, but it's going in the right way. To get to the LETI 2030 targets, we're only really seeing projects which are doing significant retrofit and refurbishment getting anywhere near those kind of levels. In terms of operational energy, just looking at the commercial office sector, this is a good example which shows the level of reduction we need. So typical office buildings in the UK are at an energy intensity of around about 300 kilowatt hours, with the best practice 25% being closer to 200. In order to get down to the Paris proof aligned targets, we need to be closer to kind of 70 kilowatt hours per meter squared, which is a significant step change, and we need to push as hard as we can. It's not about tweaking and fine tuning buildings, it's about systematic change in the way we design and operate those buildings going forward. To get us to those targets, the UK GBC and a number of other institutes have put together interim step targets. So you can see here from the UK GBC target for offices that we have whole building targets. They've broken that down into base building and tenant targets, and then set those every kind of 5 years improving. And pretty much all the buildings which you see in the media claiming to be net zero carbon in operation are hitting the interim targets. There's pretty much no buildings at the moment aligned to the Paris proof targets. Most will be net zero carbon to a date. So if you build a building that is net zero carbon meeting the 2030 targets in 2025, it's only going to be net zero carbon for 5 years. And it will only stay net zero carbon if retrofit works are actually complied. So when you're designing a new building, we need to be getting as close to these Paris proof targets as possible. And if we can't achieve the Paris proof targets, we need to be setting a pathway so that it can be improved over time. That might be improving the ICT in the building, or tweaking some of the operational parameters, or changing our MEP after 5-10 years or longer. This is linked to the Australian Neighbours scheme, which has come over to the UK, with 6 stars being roughly equivalent to the Paris aligned targets. And there aren't any buildings which at the moment are targeting or moving towards a 6-star. Most of the front running buildings that we're looking at and reviewing are kind of around about the 5.5 star, and probably won't achieve that level of performance. Will probably be coming in closer to 4.5 star at absolute best. So we still have some work to do. What's very interesting about the step targets is if we go back to the CREM trajectories we're talking about, what that basically means is if we aim for an interim target, we are still going to have a stranding point in the near future. So the further we can go down that step trajectory means the stranding point will be pushed out, and the less retrofit work we have to do. And one of the biggest discussions we have at the moment is the cost of net zero carbon. We know there is a premium for net zero carbon buildings. We've seen from the UK GBC reports that this can be between kind of 5 to 15%, but you just need to be very careful in terms of looking at that cost, because you need to compare the whole life cost, not just the upfront cost. So if we take a building that we need to get to net zero carbon in operation, if we add that kind of 10 to 15% on, it pushes the viability of that project. But if we don't do that 10 to 15% uplift in the original cost, then we will need to do that retrofit works in order to comply with the stranding, because all the buildings will need to be net zero carbon by 2050 at some point to meet government targets. And the cost of getting to net zero carbon will be significantly greater doing the works later than they will be now. So you're going to have increased operating costs, and you're going to have to pay significant costs. What we recommend is that people really focus on the fabric, because again, what you don't want to be doing is recladding and scaffolding a new building which has only been built after kind of 10 to 15 years because you haven't gone hard enough on the fabric performance. So it's really important that you get the fabric right and have a strategy potentially around plant replacement and equipment replacement, which can be phased over a number of years. But it is a false economy just saying it's an uplift. That uplift needs to be balanced on a whole life assessment. Just finish up with a few case studies. So this is one project which has done that. So this is the Eden project in Salford in Manchester, which is looking to be net zero carbon in operation. It's been designed to be NABERS 5.5 star. It's just going through the independent design review process at the moment, which is very close to the 2030 targets, and with a aspiration that the fabric is achieving near passive house standard. So fabric changes won't be needed. The changes from moving to the 2030 targets to the 2035 targets will be just fine-tuning the operating conditions with the occupiers. So it's got it's going to achieve very high standards and then have a pathway for moving to net zero carbon in the future. It's not just being done at building level. So this is a project we're working on again in Salford in Manchester. So this is a £2.5 billion redevelopment of Salford Crescent, which the master planner sets individual net zero carbon targets for individual plots and the infrastructure, both looking at embodied carbon and operational energy. It's got a significant residential proportion, which is using passive house. And one thing which we're seeing on this, but we're seeing across projects, is looking at land prices. So where we're developing schemes with local authorities, land prices are being affected. Where they're setting ESG requirements and net zero carbon requirements, the viability of schemes is being put under pressure, and that pressure is being pushed through to the actual land value associated with the project. And some local authorities have actually reduced land values significantly if they meet their ESG requirements. So that is partly funding the ESG requirements for the project. And one of the biggest things we're seeing very much in London, but we're starting to see across the country, is a requirement at planning to demonstrate net zero carbon requirements and look at whole life carbon. There's two very prominent precedents at the moment. There was obviously the Tulip, which was partly rejected on carbon reasons, looking at the amount of concrete that was needed to build the building in terms of the foundations and the structure. Also, there's an ongoing debate in the industry at the moment about the M&S redevelopment of their Oxford Street building, where they're looking to knock down the building and rebuild it. It's in a lot of social media. They made an application which was showing that there was an embodied carbon cost to the development, and a lot of people are making the case that in a climate emergency, Westminster should not be approving that scheme. We're seeing similar rejections across the country from local authorities, especially from committees who are under pressure from their constituents to demonstrate that they're meeting their climate change requirements. So there's a requirement in planning in London and starting to be developed in a number of areas that you have to demonstrate that you've looked at retrofit and refurbishment and compared that against new build scheme, knockdown and new build schemes. Looking at do nothing as well. So taking a whole life carbon approach, looking at the embodied carbon, the operational energy, and comparing that over the life span of the project to show what the carbon impact of that project would be. If you obviously new build will normally have a higher impact than retrofit and refurbishment. It's what benefits a new build could potentially bring would be why you'd build it in terms of social value and other ESG requirements. But if you can't make that strong argument for new build, then it's pushing people towards retrofit and refurbishment as we go forward. Finally, and most importantly, is existing buildings. So existing buildings will make up 70 to 80% of the buildings that are operating in 2050. So we need a significant program of retrofit to existing buildings. So we're going into quite a lot of buildings, looking at the existing performance and then looking at where we want to get to in terms of net zero carbon performance. Looking at a number of interventions like installing heat pumps, removing fossil fuels from the building, improving fabric, introducing mixed mode and natural ventilation solutions, improving the HVAC systems, and a significant proportion is associated with behaviour change. Then what we're doing with those measures is mapping them onto the CREM trajectory or a science-based target trajectory to see where the asset is, and then demonstrating through those interventions how we push out stranding events. So the risk of that asset devaluing or having void periods is reduced. And what we're seeing from a lot of clients is when they're doing technical due diligence to acquire buildings, they're looking at stranding events, they're looking at the cost of moving those stranding events out and improving the building performance. So there is definitely the business case now coming through, both in terms of retrofit, acquiring buildings, but also in terms of planning and new buildings themselves. So we're definitely seeing the market pressures around moving towards net zero carbon. So that's the end of my presentation. If you've got any questions, please let me know.
I was really interested you talking those graphs showing the way that stranding events were going to move or wanted to move forward to be further away in time from where we are now. How much do you think that existing buildings will be stranded? Because don't regulations normally apply at any point to new build rather than to buildings that are already there?
Well, this is probably the most interesting shift change we're seeing. So, as you said, the building regulations, EPCs, BREEAM, all look at design and buildings on completion. So they're not very good measures of operational energy. So what the government are looking at is mandatory energy performance of buildings. So DEFRA have done some consultation on this. And what they're potentially looking to introduce is a mandatory reporting system like DECs. So every year you take your gas and electricity meters and then you'll basically report your performance. They're looking at for large commercial offices to start with, but they'll probably introduce it for most other types of buildings. And what would be interesting is they'll start with that in terms of every year you've got to disclose your performance, but they'll start putting that in the league table, and there'll be a point where they'll start introducing fines for being below a certain level. So they'll be looking at real life performances. In reality, those fines would be fairly small. We've seen that with the other European Union energy directives. They're generally very small amounts, but what will happen is once there's a league table of office buildings, no developer, investor or landlord is going to want to have their buildings towards the bottom of that league table. So there'll be a competition to move their buildings up towards the top of those league tables. So what we're trying to do, and the industry is looking at a lot at the moment, is trying to move away from design calculations which don't bear reality and really focus on operational energy in use. So looking at that real data.
You talked about this systematic step change that is necessary for buildings to get down to the Paris targets. Do we have the technology and the ability to do that now?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. A lot of people talk about technology, but the reality is net zero carbon in operation is quite dull. It's not about adding bling in or bringing technology in. It's about making sure that everything is designed correctly. The best example we've seen is the Australian Neighbours Scheme. So Australia introduced that over a decade ago and have reduced base building energy consumption by 70%. They haven't done that by installing different equipment. They use the same heat pumps, chillers, fan core units, mechanical systems, lighting, as we do. There's almost no difference probably in the equipment. It's the way they control and operate those buildings, which is the important thing. The thing that Neighbours has done over the last decade is look at how we design buildings to be modular, to operate efficiently at all hours of the year, how we control out of hours, how we reduce energy wastage. So it's more about controls, commissioning, and how we use the building than the equipment we've got now. We've got all the tools now. There's no reason why we can't be designing all buildings to be as close to the Paris Proof target as possible.
Thank you very much. We'll have an opportunity to talk again later. I would just remind everyone before I introduce our third speaker, do please keep your questions coming in because we will have a few questions directly for him and then we will have a general discussion. And we are now moving on to that speaker who is Gary Clarke. He is Principal and Head of Science, Technology and Sustainability at HOK's London studio. And he is also Honorary Professor of Sustainable Architecture at Queen's University, Belfast. Gary, over to you.
Okay, thank you. We've got 8 years to fundamentally change how we procure and deliver buildings to address the climate emergency. And a key barrier is the perception that we can't afford to do this due to the capital cost increase of green buildings. This talk sets to debunk this myth. All the latest RBA guidance that's been released over the last couple of years embraces a whole life cycle model of sustainability. And equally, the guidance also aligns with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, all 17. But what we've done is we distilled this down to 8 sustainable outcomes that we can measure and manage on a busy project with busy project teams. So just taking a moment just to go over those sustainable outcomes, we've got the 8 along the top there. We've got net zero carbon, which is then operational. And then we got net zero embodied carbon. Together, they're kind of considered the whole life net zero carbon. Then we move on to the sustainable water cycle, sustainable conductivity and transport, sustainable land use and ecology, good health and well-being, sustainable communities and social value, which again we'll come back to later in this presentation. And then finally, we got the sustainable life cycle cost, which is the subject of this talk. So we got our 8 outcomes, which effectively is the DNA of a sustainable building. But underneath that, we've created about 24 key metrics that one could measure and manage throughout a project. But these are really up to the client, the design team to choose, obviously, which ones, maybe add more as well in terms of the different types of project. But we feel that this is kind of this baseline of actually achieving a whole holistic sort of sustainable outcome for the whole project. So just taking very quickly, I'm not going to go through everything, but really looking at the key metrics, we're talking about this in terms of the 60% reduction in energy use, operational energy use, which is part of the RBA challenge, 2030 challenge. And then we offset that remaining operational emissions. From an embodied carbon side, it's about retrofit first, and we tried to aim for that 50% reduction in embodied carbon from benchmarks, and then we offset that 50%. Sustainable water cycle, again, it's trying to aim for that 40% reduction, and the 3 of those is really the RBA 2030 challenge. Then moving on to sustainable conductivity and transport. Again, it's all about that placing mixed-use development, placing it next to public transport, and obviously high-speed broadband connection, as we're hopefully going to prove today. Then sustainable land use, and really is trying to reuse brownfield site, but then increase the biodiversity about 20%. And there's an urban green factor, which is part of the London plan, which we think is a fantastic metric. Moving on to good health and well-being, there's kind of certain levels of internal CO2 levels and health and well-being of off-gassing, and then adaptive thermal comfort as well as daylight is that kind of core metrics. Moving on to sustainable communities and social value, again, this kind of key metrics which I'm going to talk about later in the thing, but effectively comes down to it's creating a place that actually supports the community and provides lots of kind of benefits for that in terms of local jobs right the way through to community engagement. And the final one, which we're going to talk about today, is this kind of sustainable life cycle cost. So I'm going to move on to this. And what do we mean by sustainable whole life cost and value? Well, again, the graphic at the left side is really that thing where obviously this is a kind of business model for architecture and business and buildings. It's balancing cost and value. And obviously our clients are looking for more value than cost over the whole life of the project. And effectively that's the same on this kind of micro level. And the question really is, can we afford to enhance our buildings to create better sustainable outcomes? What's the cost of that and what's the value? So what we're looking at is the cost is the capital cost, the capex, and then the opex, which is the operational cost of the facility. And then if you add all the operational savings in terms of energy and maintenance costs, plus the benefits of enhanced well-being and productivity of the inhabitants, as well as kind of the rental premium, which we'll talk about later, and then adding that wider social value on top, then does that outweigh the balance of the cost? And I believe it does, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. Now, the graph to the right is a Seminal Graph. This was, you can see there, back in 2005. Now, I've been using it for 17 years, and I've been trying to get our cost consultant colleagues to redo this graph for 17 years, but we haven't really done it yet. So I think really is the challenge to anybody listening here to really attempt to do this, and we need the evidence to really support this work. But this study was based on a CoStar study back in 2005, looking at LEED Platinum buildings and the potential savings of that. So it's exactly the question that we'll be proposing to ourselves. So what they looked at was a 20-year net present value And what they discovered with some of the early sort of LEED Platinum buildings in the States is you could get a saving of about $5 per square foot. And then taking emissions, water and waste together, again, you've got probably about $2 or $3 a square foot there. Obviously, that's at 2005, but the cost of carbon and the cost of emissions and so forth, water is all kind of going up in terms of utility. So again, this figure would be, I think, even more savings in terms of nowadays. But then whatever the energy cost is, the potential savings for operation and maintenance, you can see there's almost double the energy, about $10 a square foot. And then when you look at the productivity and health well-being, which is then the US study used a 50% productivity increase, then that outweighs everything. You can see that adds up everything above that. So a huge benefit. And this is where I think our clients, our developer clients, are really interested in this. And then the cost premium back then for a LEED Platinum building was about, say, $5 a square foot as well. So again, that's where we are. That's where we were for, 2005. So let's look at the evidence of where we are now in terms of the UK. So this is a study done by our engineering colleagues, which actually is a great graph. It plots out all the kind of I suppose, the best performing low energy buildings in the UK, and you can see there's quite a lot there. And what it sets is this kind of target where it's 150 kilowatt hours per square meter for a good practice modern office. The previous benchmark was about 225, but obviously this is variability in terms of how one is designed the building and then how's it run. But effectively, you can see that the trend is moving down in terms of the newer buildings, obviously towards the right-hand side of the slide. And where the trajectory is down to around about 100 kilowatt hours per square meter. Now, just to point out, this is actual real data measured, and this is actually full operational energy. So this is actually regulated and unregulated energy together. So it all aligns with our RBA sort of targets. And we can see there the target we set for the RBA challenge, and also Letty has actually set that as well, is 55 kilowatt hours per square meter. So we can see there's a couple of buildings that actually have achieved that, very close to achieving it. And this is the thing, the trajectory is that, and we're really kind of positive that we can get to that with obviously all your support, and then we need to upscale obviously the profession to that level. But that represents a 60% saving from a typical office now, and maybe about 80% from the previous one in terms of 225. So if you monetize that, that is a huge amount of money in terms of savings for the client. And then obviously the energy costs, as we know, are going to double this year. So again, that saving is going to be even greater. So that's the first level of energy savings. Moving into maintenance, this is a bit more tricky. This is there's limited research in terms of the cost of maintenance, but the graph I'm using, or the table I'm using, is from the Usable Bildungsstrasse. It's Bill Bordas and Adrian Lehman. So they've written some great papers on this in the past. And the concept they talk about is unmanageable complexity. And what they mean by that is you're going to create a very kind of complex building with lots of kind of BMS, lots of kind of mixed mode in terms of air handling units plus natural ventilation. So the more complexity you put in the building, it comes a point where it's almost unmanageable to try and sort of manage that building. And then the graph here, you can see here the type A. So I'm going to point to the screen here. So the type A is here, which is effectively this type of buildings, which has got everything in there. It says mixed mode. It's got mechanical plus natural, all BMS controlled, and it is effective when it works well. It's got greater functionality, but actually it comes really with a cost there. So we've got to really be very careful about throwing too much technology at the problem. And then the corollary of that one is really the type B. So this is really where I think we probably all need to be, is taking a step back and thinking about effective approach. It can be low impact and often small scale, but we need to scale this up. Now, the building that they're referencing here is the Elizabeth Fry building in Norwich, and the building performance evaluating team have been tracking that building for 30 years. It is the best performing higher education building in the UK for over 30 years in terms of its energy plus its occupant satisfaction. And that's actually a thermodeck, naturally ventilated building. So very simple. So this is kind of really what we're saying. To get that operation and maintenance savings, you've got to think twice about very complex buildings in terms of management. An example of the of what happens with the complexity and in terms of energy cost as well as maintenance is this one. Is a study done by Bureau Happold a few years ago, and they looked at one of their own buildings that they designed, came in and analysed it. Now, what was happening here, if I just talk through, I'm going to point as well, is this was the daily cycle. Obviously, this is a year apart. You see, this is part of a building performance evaluation or PUE. So you can see the daily cycle there. There's normally, when it's shut during the base load, it's kind of quite high. And then there's a peak during the day, obviously peaking around about just after lunch. And then it sort of tails down in terms of people sort of leaving. And then there's people cleaning. And then it sort of gradually goes down to its base load. But they discovered that actually with that fine tuning, and it's all fine tuning, is they could get better efficiency. So they managed to reduce the base load at night. And you really, it's almost kind of this is a heart monitoring device for a building, where you try and get that base load as low as possible. And then the peak you need to sort of top down as well. So you can see there enormous amount of savings. Everything in yellow is saved, which then equated to about £40,000 a year, and that's on a 10 pence per kilowatt. So imagine when you double the price, then you're going to double the saving as well. So, and I think that's the aim, is we're trying to get that pulse of the building as low and as accurate as possible, and the base load obviously as close to zero as possible. So moving on to health, well-being, and the link to productivity. Again, I'm using a source here from Usable Building Trusts. This is again Bill and Adrian's work, and this is a kind of seminal kind of diagram here. Now, the key thing to highlight there is actually this perceived productivity. This isn't measured productivity, because we know how difficult it is to measure productivity, and equally, it's even though this is kind of linked to different types of ventilation buildings and complexity of kind of servicing. At the same time, there's other factors there that affect productivity in terms of, perhaps management or more social aspects of it. But the interesting here in terms of the study is, if you look at the cycle here, that actually the best performing buildings are mostly natural or advanced natural buildings, and you get that between 5 and 10% productivity gains, or perceived productivity gains. So that's very interesting, and I think it really highlights, which we've known anecdotally as well, is the contact outside, and then the physical control of your space of an occupant is actually probably the most important things that we can give our occupants. And with that, you're going to get benefits. People are going to be happier and more productive when they're actually in, especially obviously when we come back after COVID. The natural ventilation is extremely important to get this right. And really, we can see there, if you then sort of take 10% of an average employee's wage, that's where the American co-study really kind of added up there, that the figures would be absolutely enormous. And this is what our clients and our building developers are really kind of key on. So moving on to the next one, which is then taking on the rental premium. And then really this 3 studies which came out last year, which I think sums up the kind of it basically is the business model of many of our clients. They're looking at the capital cost increase versus what premium they would get for their building. And that's the crude calculation. And we can see there the UK GBC study, which was excellent. It's building the case for net zero. This was more looking at the kind of add costs of sustainability, and while the Knight Frank and GLL are looking at the premiums. So just taking the first one in terms of UK GBC, the range that they studied was 3 different levels of kind of sustainability, and the figures came back in terms of cost modelling was 8 to 17% capital cost increase. Now, what I'd really sort of kind of highlight is the 70% is I think is related to buildings which you throw a lot of technology at it, and we really kind of highlighted the risk of doing that. If we're talking about, for me, simple, very simple buildings, which is then carefully designed with an emphasis on passive design, and then perhaps a passive house plus approach, then I believe it's more towards the 8% capital cost increase and not the 70%. So we've got to be careful of how we take these figures. And but some of my colleagues, and again in my own work in various firms, I always say to the client, I could actually achieve best performing buildings at no extra cost, and particularly practices like Archetype have achieved that in many different sectors. The only thing that's kind of difficult is the add cost of significant renewables, especially ground source heat pumps or PV and things like that. But normally what I suggest using, and again quite successful, is a spend to save type approach, where you ring fence the extra cost of renewables, and you say to the client, right, well, here's the extra cost of this, but then you work out the cost savings, and in a number of projects that's been quite successful. One with James Dyson, there's a whole ground source heat pump array that was argued that way, and then really you're saying, well, it's 10-year investment, and after 10 years you're going to get that savings back over the whole life. So this is where this whole life costing is extremely important. You can't just look at the capital cost; it's a long-term benefit here. So that's the costs. Then looking at the premiums, and it's very interesting. So I think our agent colleagues are really waking up. And as I said, I've given this talk, for the last 20 years. 20 years ago, our agents were very shy to come forward to put down some premiums, and it's great to see this. This is really starting to really kind of get benefits. There is actually, you can see there, an upper limit of 12.3% from Knight Frank, 11% from JLL, which is all good. So circa about 10% premium. But this is all, I think, a trajectory of travel, because in terms of COP26 last year, the government put everybody on notice that your CSR will be checked and ruled in the future. So again, our clients will want to only occupy sustainable buildings that actually prove what they're doing. So I think it's going to drive the premiums up, and also no client wants a stranded asset. So I think this is where the win-win of a sustainable building, this premiums will go up immeasurably. I was on a call with one of our American developer clients, and in America the premiums are well above this. I mean, it's we're touching double that figure. So I think direction of travel are there, and really we need to be ready for it. So final sort of metric, just touching on, is social value. And I think whatever the costs and value of the previous slides, the cost to society and the benefits to society is greater. And I think we've got to remind ourselves that the fundamental reason of architecture is to create buildings that shelter and provide comfort, but also places that bring joy. Now, these are the key metrics that one sort of measures on social value, and it's all part of our government questionnaire now, mandatory question on social value. It's about local jobs and apprentices. It's about local training as well of people working in the building and the community. It's building as far as possible with local materials, but it's actually, again, dovetailing with our health and well-being benefits. It's about the health and well-being of the residents, the occupants, and the community itself. And then it's a wider community benefit. And all those kind of principles really embodied into HOK, our latest family resident that was completed at the end of last year at Q, which embodies all that. So taken together, and I think if you add a cost onto that, is immeasurable, really. I think that some studies looking at even the contact to outside in terms of a green space, that's kind of averaging £3,000 per person for a community. So you can add all that together, and I think it's extraordinary. And obviously the health benefits of an active place as well. So that's kind of all the various kind of metrics. But so let's pull together and then see how how the business case looks. So we talked about capital cross industries, and so circa say about 10%. But I think, as I said, that's kind of for me is a worst case scenario. And then hopefully with the skills and our kind of creativity of architecture, we can do that at no extra cost, apart from obviously the renewables, which you talked about. But that's versus an up to a 60% energy cost saving for the best performing buildings, which in itself is enormous cost. Plus we add that significant operational savings that we talked about, but we've got to be mindful of adding unmanageable complexity. So again, we've got to be very careful of how we design our buildings in the future. Then adding a circa 10% perceived well-being and productivity value. And again, just being very kind of careful not to kind of draw the conclusion there, but you think about that in terms of a monetary value, it's enormous in terms of the kind of the health and well-being of our staff. Then adding that 10% rental premium, which I think will be going up, I think, as we speak. And I'm sure there's some examples of buildings such as the White Collar Factory, which I'd be love to hear what the kind of rental premium of that building is. I'm sure it might be greater than 10%. And then adding on that final one, which is the significant social value, which I think is immeasurable. So taking all those points together, plus you add the climate emergency emergency, the pressing matter, this 8 years kind of deadline, the question really is can we afford to do this? But the question is we cannot afford not to do this. Thank you very much.
We're going to have a little discussion between ourselves, and then I'm going to invite the others to come in and join us as well. One of the questions that's come in for you, Gary, someone said, wouldn't it make sense to enshrine the sustainable metrics that you covered at the planning stage?
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. I think we have actually lobbied government to do that. I've been in many meetings, and my RBA lobbyist kind of colleagues have been promoting that as well. I think it's really well. I think from last year, the future planning, I think there's some good things, but there was kind of lots of things I think were a bit worrying. So hopefully, when they're going to redo this, and I think it's maybe Michael Gove is maybe that's his remit now. We need to kind of act together and speak with one voice, because I think if as a construction industry, if we all believe that, then we should all actually push for that together. But yeah, I totally think that should be the case. But I think that's probably an obvious kind of request, really.
Thank you very much. You showed a chart where you showed different levels of complexity and maintenance, from the sort of very complex, highly maintained building down to what you saw, and I'm absolutely with you, as the desirable, which is a building which actually works very well without a lot of complex systems in it. But you said that those buildings tended to be rather small. And I just wonder, I mean, there is a pressure, particularly in major city centres, for quite large office buildings. Do you feel that approach is translatable to larger buildings?
Yeah, I do, and in all my design work and all the practices I work with, that's what I try and do. I think those principles, I think, are scalable, translatable. I think what the issues are is when you come into urban, busy areas, then the urban pollution and noise. That's where our engineering colleagues actually sort of hold me back a little bit. So I'm a bit optimistic, and obviously they're rightly more pessimistic. Is that you've got to think about the kind of final conditions about that. But I do think it's scalable, and I think we need more of those types of buildings. And I think it's a kind of plea to our kind of professional colleagues there, really think twice about the complexity of the buildings we're creating. I think the speakers talked about that. That sort of that worry of actually trying to do too much, and what Neighbours has taught the Australian construction industry is to do things more simply and do it well.
Thank you. I mean, it's interesting when you talk about polluted and noisy city centres. Obviously, more and more we are trying to keep vehicles out of our city centres, although we don't seem to be being hugely successful in that, except when we have pandemic lockdowns. But in those terms, is the increasing introduction of electric vehicles going to be a game changer in terms of allowing natural ventilation in places where it actually seems mad at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. That we're actually looking at that for a couple of clients in Cambridge, where the urban porosity models and pollution models of future sort of transport modes are taken into consideration. So what I'd say is that we've got to, and it's picking up Simon's point there, is we've got to design buildings not for the now. We've also got to design them for a future climate, and the future climate is obviously warming, is the resilience of it, but also it's the danger of outages and things like that in terms of energy supply. So I think we should design our buildings to allow the windows to open, even if at the current stage it's maybe difficult for some clients and some engineers to kind of get their head around that. That's what we should be doing. So at a certain point in time, when we're all cycling and driving to work and electric vehicles, then noise will be less, and then pollution will be there, so we can open our windows and enjoy the free ventilation.
I'm going to invite our other speakers to come back in now. And we've had some interesting questions come in, which I think we could all address. One of them is somebody asking, they say net zero takes us to 2030. Global sustainability requires that we do better. So how do you design for that? Simon, do you have an answer?
Yeah, well, net zero is not 2030. Net zero carbon is to align to limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees. Most people are setting targets to do that by 2030. The whole debate around net zero carbon was interestingly framed on the BBC actually recently, which is if we all hit our net zero carbons but do it in 2050, 2040, we will have spent our 1.5 degree budget and probably spent our 2 degree budget. So net zero carbon alone is not enough. It's the speed that we do net zero carbon, which is just as important as the targets themselves. We need to decarbonize to within the 1.5 degree carbon budget, and that needs us all to act very fast. Most people latch on to dates and set targets around dates, but the dates are pretty meaningless. We have a limited carbon budget which we globally can't exceed.
Yeah, so if I just pick up on that point, when we were writing, obviously I was part of the team that wrote all the RBA guidance. The reason we chose 2030 is simply that we've got to allow our community and our peers time to catch up with actually the most advanced teams. We can do it now. I think that's the thing. So, and to come back to the question, is we've got to do it now. But when you look at the 10 years, it was allowing people 10 years, 2 iterations of a project, 2 5-year projects for you to get up to speed. And it's signaling that actually that's the point in time. But that's for new and deep retrofit buildings. That's the last point that we need to all the buildings to be new buildings to be net zero. But then the big elephant in the room is actually the 45 million existing buildings that need to be retrofitted.
Yes, I mean, we touched on retrofit, but I think we probably haven't talked about it enough. Perhaps we'll come back to that in a second. We've got a question here, which I think is interesting because it's talking about something else. And of course, we do understand that sustainability is not just to do with carbon, although that's so important. And I think there's something behind this question, which is interesting. It says, how does the suggested reduction in water use compare with the huge losses from network leakage by the water companies? Now, with the best will in the world, no architect can design a building that's going to counteract that. But I suppose it is partly a feeling of, are there some things which are not really worth bothering about that much because the building itself has so little control over it?
The thinking behind is part of the RBA 2030 challenge is actually a reduction in water use. So again, what we're saying is a 40% reduction in potable water use for all building types. And the aim there is actually to take the pressure off the actually existing infrastructure. So if you can use that rainwater recycling to flush toilets, for instance, then that helps to reduce the demand on potable water use, and also you kind of sort of reduce the impact in terms of the how much kind of water is going into the system. So it's you're taking the pressure off, and if we all do that at a building level, that will reduce the capacity needs and everything we talked about there. But that doesn't take all the water companies off the hook. They've got to do their bit as well, and they've got to upgrade their infrastructure. Rather than making profits, I think that they've got to invest in actually making an efficient and not wasteful system.
I think they're definitely having to do that, and it really depends what region you're in. The UK water scarcity is not a major issue at the moment, but it will become more of an issue going forward. But where we're working in places like Australia, water conservation is huge. And what we see with sustainability is we kind of have fads. So health and wellbeing was the fad 4 or 5 years ago. Net zero carbon's the fad at the moment. Climate resilience looks to be the next one coming along. I expect water scarcity will probably be one of the biggest ones after 2025, 2030. With the impacts of climate change affecting us. So yes, I've seen multiple reports looking at water consumption in the UK, and leakage is definitely up there at the top. But interestingly, cooling towers for power stations is right up there. So again, if we decommission a lot of coal and gas power stations, then that will free up a lot of water. But we're going to need a lot of work, especially in the southeast, in terms of water conservation to deal with the droughts that are coming with future climate.
Okay, another question. Obviously, we talk about energy use in terms of kilowatt hours per metre squared per year. And we've talked quite rightly about getting that number down. But I'm wondering, what about getting the metres squared down? I know that certainly in the past, office occupancy rates have been pretty small in terms of percentage of space occupied per day. And we've now obviously had the pressure for people to work at home, and a lot of people want to continue to work at home, even though Google's saying, let's get everybody back in the office. And I wonder whether clients, as part of their sustainability, how much they're actually looking at having less space rather than just environmentally better space. I'm not saying one instead of the other, I'm saying one as well as the other. Elaine, is that something you've seen?
That's a really good question. I think we are, as you rightly point out, office densities have been falling considerably over the last 30 years. We probably think they're probably at their lowest level now. And I think the pandemic is forcing people to really reassess how they are using their office space. I think the return to work obviously is slower than obviously we'd anticipated when we first went into lockdown. Most surveys typically are showing that people are kind of resting on wanting to be in the office 2 to 3 days a week. And that seems to have been fairly stable over the last 6 months or so. And I think what you're starting to see is the way that, you know, the trends of how we use offices are likely to move towards more collaboration space. You know, that's what the role of the office is going to be. It's bringing people in into the office for doing that collaboration work rather than those task-based spaces. So actually what this means is that you might not see any further reduction in actual office densities, because actually you might need more space per person. Because we haven't gone back into the office yet, the kind of data around that is still fairly slim in terms of data to support that. I think the other issue that you have in terms of, you say, reducing those the overall footprint, of course, is that you don't, at the moment, I think, you don't know what days people are going to come in. So unless you force people to come in on certain days, you're always going to be managing for peak occupancy. Therefore, it reduces the scope that many occupiers may have to reduce their overall footprint. And again, I think at the moment, I think our latest survey shows about half of companies haven't actually developed a workforce strategy when people return to the office on a more ongoing basis. So I think that it's something that may happen for some companies, but not overall.
I just add on to that, because I'm just really curious that in addition to having possibly less space, or possibly not because you're using it differently, are people looking seriously at the impact of working at home? I mean, I know that obviously if you're trying to design an environmentally sustainable building, you want to be near a public transport load, or you want to be able to cycle. But obviously the transport costs of working from home, even if it's only part of the time, is near to zero. But on the other hand, people may be heating and lighting their inefficient homes.
Absolutely.
Simon, you're nodding, so I'm guessing you might have looked a bit at this.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been a few studies looking at the impact of working from home, and we work with quite a few organisations doing their carbon footprinting, and scope 3 emissions were difficult enough. Now trying to estimate the impact of people's heating at home and lighting and small power at home is added to the complexity of their data collection for scope 3. It really depends. As you say, if it's over winter, what we saw was office buildings in the city didn't actually turn down that much in terms of their energy consumption. So all the offices were empty, but they were all running fairly full. A lot of them, when they did have people in, were running ventilation 24 hours a day. So actually some energy consumption went up in the offices. And on top of that, we had everyone at home using energy in their demises, which most in the UK are very poorly insulated and efficient houses. So it has huge potential to save in transport if we're moving away. But if people are in poorly insulated homes, have the heating on, and they were cycling or getting public transport to work, they're actually pushing their emissions up. It's just the calculations of that is astronomical. So it's a dual-edged sword. So there's no right answer to it. It needs to be investigated and reviewed.
Gary, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's just to say that our workplace all our international companies globally on this issue. So I think every company is actually trying to form that kind of strategy. But until we know, at the point of post-Omicron or whatever comes next, then I think it's still up in the air. But picking up sort of the point there, there will be a peak occupancy. So what we're thinking is actually there might not be the main reduction in size of built area, because you need everybody in at a certain point, and until the point where we kind of look at the ventilation strategy, you might have to have an increased area or actually less people in that peak time. So that for us is the main thing. But where it really comes down to is the efficiency of the buildings, and I think picking up Simon's point is that we've got to have systems where the buildings switch themselves off. As we talked about that Bureau-Happel graph, the base load of buildings has got to be lower. It's got to be in that kind of 10% level if we to achieve our kind of climate ambitions.
I'd just like to sum something up, because I think it's going to result in my last question, which is, we've talked about the fact that a lot of clients are looking really seriously at their sustainability credentials now. Some of it out of pressure to recruit, some of it pressure from investors, and one hopes some of it because they really believe in this. At the same time, we've been saying we don't need incredibly whizzy new technology in order to make our buildings perform better. Are the three of you actually feeling quite optimistic, or are you seeing some big barriers that we have to overcome? I'm going to start with Elaine again.
Yeah, I think, you have to start from a position of optimism. I'm always a glass kind of half full person anyway. And I think the industry has, the real estate industry is renowned for kind of responding to things relatively slowly. It's, we know it's a slow moving industry more generally, but actually the pace of change, the pace of talk has increased dramatically. And I think that's one thing that's really impressive. But I think now is the time for that talk to be turned into action. And what we're hearing from our clients increasingly over the last, as we're kind of moving out of the pandemic phase, is that's what they're starting to look at. They're looking at their strategies. So they're looking at, talk into action. I think that's the trend we're expecting for the coming 12 months or so, and obviously beyond that.
Simon.
Yeah, it's a good question. It kind of goes in waves, I think, between optimism and complete pessimism and despair over the last couple of years. As it is indicated, the pace has been amazing. The collaboration across industry, the work that RIBA, LETI, UKGBC have done is moving us all in the right direction, and all the noise is really positive. But at the same time, we're already starting to see gamification, people trying to bend the rules, huge amounts of greenwash. So we need action, and we need real action, and we need to just make sure that we have a robust system, that there isn't easy ways to get around what we're asking people to do, and really focus on performance and use rather than just calculations which tick a box. We need to be focusing on the performance of a new building and then monitoring it on a yearly basis throughout its life to make sure that it operates constantly at that level. So we're going in the right direction, but there's still a lot of work needed.
Thank you. Gary?
Yeah, just really watch out for greenwash, and for me it's about the principle of disclosure. As soon as we get to the point where we've all got to disclose our energy usage, especially companies through the CSR, that will be a game changer. No one will be able to hide behind greenwashing, and it's all about delivery of action. So I think auditing and disclosure, the design for performance tools, is where we need to be.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all our speakers. I think you have been absolutely ace. Thank you. And you've responded to all the questions, which is great. And I'd like to thank everyone who sent questions in. Thank you all very much for attending. This will be available to watch again or to tell your friends about. And I just think on behalf of Architecture Today and of Schu, I'd just like to thank you all very much for being here, and thank you again to our speakers, and goodbye.